A doctor's fingers press against a soldier's neck, searching for a pulse that isn't there. The man on the stretcher is a ruin, face swollen beyond recognition, jaw shattered, body torn open by bullets, shrapnel, and a bayonet wound that runs clean through both forearms. He hasn't moved in minutes. He can't speak. By every clinical measure available in a combat hospital in 1968, Staff Sergeant Roy Benavidez is dead, and the doctor reaches for the zipper on the body bag. That's when Benavidez, unable to open his ruined jaw to speak, unable to lift a hand to signal, does the only thing his body still has left in it. He spits in the doctor's face. 6 hours earlier, he had jumped off a helicopter with nothing but a knife and a medical bag into a jungle clearing where 12 men were about to die. This is what it cost him to make sure they didn't. This is Roy Benavidez, the man who taught himself to walk. To understand why Roy Benavidez ran toward that clearing instead of away from it, and you have to understand what he had already survived by the time he got there. Born in 1935 near Cuero, Texas, to a Mexican-American father and a Yaqui mother, Benavidez was orphaned before he was 8 years old, raised afterward by relatives, and pulled out of school young to work picking cotton and sugar beets. He joined the Army at 19, went through airborne training, and by 1965 was serving in Vietnam as a military advisor. That tour ended when he stepped on a landmine on patrol, an injury serious enough that doctors told him, in plain terms, that he would never walk again. He didn't accept that answer. Over more than a year of hospitalization at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, against direct medical advice, Benavidez spent his nights sneaking out of bed to prop himself against the wall of his hospital room and force his legs to bear weight, inch by inch, night after night, until he could walk again on his own. He didn't just recover. He volunteered for Special Forces training, earned his Green Beret, and returned to Vietnam for a second tour, this time with Detachment B-56, 5th Special Forces Group, operating out of a forward base at Loc Ninh, hard against the Cambodian border. The nights of teaching himself to walk again left a mark on him that went beyond the physical. Nurses on the ward had grown used to a soldier who refused the wheelchair parked by his bed, who gritted through pain that would have kept most men still, simply to prove to himself, more than to anyone watching, that the diagnosis wasn't the end of the story. It was, in its own quiet way, the same stubbornness that would define the 6 hours he would spend, years later, refusing to accept that a battle was already lost. Long before, there was a jungle clearing to run into. There was a hospital corridor he refused to accept as his final limit. By the time he reached Loc Ninh on his second tour, the men around him had already given him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his career, Tango Mike Mike, radio shorthand for that mean Mexican. Half nickname, half badge of respect from soldiers who had already seen what he was willing to push through. The team that couldn't get out. On the morning of the 2nd of May, 1968, a 12-man Special Forces reconnaissance team, 3 Americans and 9 Montagnard tribal fighters, was inserted by helicopter into dense jungle west of Loc Ninh, tasked with confirming reports of major North Vietnamese army activity in the area. The reports turned out to be badly understated. Within a short time on the ground, the team walked into contact with a North Vietnamese force numbering in the hundreds. By some later estimates, close to a full battalion of roughly 1,000 men. Pinned down, badly outnumbered, and taking casualties, the team radioed for emergency extraction. 3 helicopters attempted the pickup. All 3 were driven back by a wall of ground fire and anti-aircraft fire so intense that landing wasn't possible. The helicopters limped back to Loc Ninh to offload wounded crew and assess damage, and it was there, at the forward base, listening to the radio traffic of a team he knew personally being slowly ground down, with no way out, that Roy Benavidez made his decision. The radio traffic itself was its own kind of torment for anyone standing near it. Static, broken transmissions, a voice reporting another man down, then another, and behind it all the flat, matter-of-fact tones soldiers learn to use precisely because panic on the radio gets people killed faster than the enemy does. One of the men trapped in that clearing, Sergeant First Class Leroy Wright, had saved Benavidez's own life on an earlier operation only a month before. Listening to that debt come due in real time over a crackling radio with 3 helicopters already turned back was not an abstraction for Benavidez. It was a friend's voice, running out of time. He wasn't ordered onto the next helicopter. He volunteered, grabbing a medical bag and a knife, no rifle, no body armor beyond his uniform, and climbed aboard. 6 hours in hell. When I got on that chopper, Benavidez would say years later, little did I know we were going to spend 6 hours in hell. The helicopter couldn't land in the clearing. Enemy fire was too heavy. Benavidez jumped from several feet up while the aircraft hovered and ran roughly 75 yards across open ground under direct fire to reach the trapped team. He was hit in the leg and knocked down before he even arrived. He got back up and kept moving. A grenade blast added shrapnel wounds to his face, arm, and back before he had done anything but reach the men he'd come for. From that point, for 6 continuous hours, Benavidez organized the defense of a position that should not have been defensible. He redistributed ammunition. He administered morphine and first aid to the wounded and dying. He called in airstrikes and directed medevac helicopters toward the position again and again, even as each attempt drew fresh waves of enemy fire. At one point, a North Vietnamese soldier closed on him directly and stabbed him with a bayonet. Benavidez pulled the blade free, killed the man with his own knife, and kept working. He killed at least 2 more enemy soldiers with a rifle taken from the battlefield, while providing covering fire for men boarding an evacuation helicopter that would, minutes later, crash after its pilot was killed. He did not stop to count what was happening to his own body. By the time the ordeal ended, Roy Benavidez had been shot at least 7 times, cut open by shrapnel in 28 separate places across his back, neck, head, legs, feet, and hands, stabbed through both forearms by a bayonet, and struck across the back of the head hard enough by a rifle butt to fracture his jaw. 37 individual wounds by the final count. He kept working through all of them, because the alternative was watching the men around him die for lack of one more pair of hands. The physical mechanics of what he was doing during those 6 hours are almost difficult to hold in the mind at once, dragging wounded men across open ground toward whatever cover existed, ripping open field dressings with hands that were themselves torn and bleeding, shouting corrections into a radio handset through a jaw that was breaking apart with every word. Every function a human body uses to signal that it has had enough, pain, blood loss, shock, was firing at once, and Benavidez simply kept moving through all of it, because stopping meant someone else stopped breathing. Before he allowed himself to be pulled aboard the helicopter that finally successfully extracted the survivors, Benavidez made one final pass through the site to be certain no classified material had been left behind for the enemy to recover. A detail that speaks, as much as anything else that day, to exactly how much of himself he had left to give, even after there was nothing visibly left to give. The body bag. By the time the helicopter reached the base, Benavidez had lost enough blood that he had slipped toward unconsciousness. He could not speak. His jaw was broken. When he was brought in for triage, a doctor checked for a pulse, found none he could detect, and made the reasonable clinical call: place him with the dead. The triage area that day was overwhelmed in the way combat hospitals become overwhelmed after a mass casualty event. Stretchers lined up faster than doctors could move between them, medics making split-second decisions about who could still be saved and who couldn't, working from the same brutal calculus every wartime hospital has had to use since the invention of triage itself. In that environment, a man with no detectable pulse, catastrophic blood loss, and a face too swollen to recognize was not a controversial call. He was one more body among many, and the staff had dozens of others who might still be helped. As he was zipped into a body bag alongside the men who genuinely hadn't survived, a friend recognized him and called out. A doctor came to check again and still found nothing to indicate life. In the last version of himself, he had left, unable to speak, unable to raise an arm. Benavidez managed the one act his body could still perform. He spit in the doctor's face. It was enough. The doctors pulled him back into treatment, and against what most of the medical staff in that hospital privately expected, he survived. 13 years late. Roy Benavidez's actions that day saved at least 8 men. For the extraordinary heroism of the rescue, he was initially awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, a high honor, but not the nation's highest, in part because the paperwork supporting a Medal of Honor recommendation required a first-hand witness account, and the officer who had originally recommended him for the higher award had been evacuated, badly wounded himself, before the process was completed. For over a decade, that was where the record stood. Benavidez returned to the United States, recovered from wounds most doctors had not expected him to survive, and continued his military career at Fort Riley and later Fort Sam Houston, carrying in a very literal sense pieces of the battle still lodged in his body, while the official record of what he had actually done that day remained incomplete on paper. It wasn't until years later that a key witness to the battle came forward with the detailed, first-hand account the Medal of Honor process required, allowing the case to be reopened and properly reviewed against what had actually happened in that clearing. The delay was not a reflection of doubt about Benavidez's courage. It was a reflection of how thin the paper trail can become when the men who witness the worst of a battle are themselves evacuated, wounded, or unable to testify in the narrow bureaucratic window the process demands. On the 24th of February, 1981, 13 years after the battle, President Ronald Reagan presented Roy Benavidez with the Medal of Honor at the Pentagon. Benavidez characteristically deflected the praise. "The real heroes," he said, "are the ones who gave their lives for their country. I don't like to be called a hero." Roy Benavidez carried pieces of shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life, fragments that, decades later, would still occasionally work their way to the surface of old wounds. He spent his final years not resting on the honor he'd been given, but testifying before Congress on behalf of disabled veterans' benefits, at one point publicly fighting the government's own attempt to cut off his disability payments on the grounds that a man with 2 pieces of shrapnel still lodged near his heart could, on paper, be found fit for employment. He died in 1998 and is buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, the same city where, as a young sergeant with a shattered spine, doctors had once told him he'd never walk again. Roy Benavidez proved that judgment wrong twice in his life, once alone in a hospital room, teaching his own legs to hold his weight again, and once, 6 hours at a time, in a jungle clearing outside Loc Ninh, refusing to accept that 37 wounds meant the job was finished. This is Roy Benavidez, the man who spit in death's face twice and meant it both times. Subscribe for more untold stories of the men who did what everyone else said was impossible.